Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the 57th webinar in this offshore wind series, Learning from the Experts. I am Layla El-Ashmawi, a Senior Project Manager with NYSERDA's offshore wind team, and it is my pleasure to be joined by today's expert, Joseph Majkut with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Before I introduce our speaker, a few reminders for participants and some backgrounds on this webinar series. Next slide, please. Firstly, if you are experiencing any technical issues, please contact Adam Hauk at the email address on the bottom of this slide. This webinar is being recorded, and the recordings and presentation slides for all webinars in the Learning from the Expert series are available on NYSERDA's website and at the address on this slide. All participants have been muted. We will have time for Q&A following the presentation, so please use the Slido feature to submit your questions. Next slide, please. New York State is working to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of at least 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. Offshore wind is a critical component in achieving the state's goal of 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. While offshore wind has been providing clean energy to other parts of the world for several decades, this industry is brand new to New Yorkers. To provide interested stakeholders and members of the public with accessible, impartial information and opportunities for engagement on specific topics of interest, NYSERDA is hosting this educational webinar series called Learning from the Experts to connect the public with independent experts in key topics in offshore wind. We endeavor to select learning from the expert speakers based on their expertise, not necessarily for an alignment of opinions with NYSERDA or the state of New York. If you would like to suggest a topic or a speaker for a future webinar, you can email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov or fill out a survey also available on our website. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter. Next slide, please. It is now my pleasure to introduce Joseph Majkut. Joseph Majkut is the Director of Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he leads the program's work understanding the geopolitics of energy and climate change and working to ensure a global energy transition that is responsive to the risks of climate change and the economic and strategic priorities of the United States and the world. Joseph is an expert in climate science, climate policy, and risk and uncertainty analysis for decision making. He holds a PhD from Princeton University in atmospheric and oceanic sciences, a master's degree in applied mathematics from Delft University of Technology, and a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Harvey Mudd College. Thank you so much, and I will now hand things over to Joseph.
Layla, thank you very much. Hope I'm coming through loud and clear, or I will be instructed otherwise. It's my real pleasure to join you all today to talk about this important industry and the role it may play in bolstering our national energy security. Just a little bit about our center here at CSIS, if I may. We sit within the world's preeminent national security and foreign policy think tank. And for decades, our team here has had a outstanding energy program, mainly focused on oil and gas markets. And the reasons for that are probably pretty obvious. Post oil embargo and throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, energy security really was synonymous with the ability of the country to access oil markets. But as we now enter a phase where the energy system is diversifying, where driven by climate considerations, by technology interventions, the way that we are thinking about energy security is really changing. So our program now looks across a wide variety of technologies, regions, and political analyses to try and understand how leaders and industry are thinking about energy security in a modern context. And I hope we can spend a little bit of time today talking about that. But as for the viewers, I do hope you can check out the excellent work my colleagues and I do here at CSIS. We've got folks working on traditional oil and gas market analysis, on low carbon innovation, on questions related to the politics and geopolitics of climate change and energy trade, We'll touch on a lot of those issues today, but we've got just outstanding work being done here by myself, well, by my colleagues, and I work here too. And it's really a pleasure to kind of share and apply some of the insights that we've gleaned looking at the whole energy system on a more national context and at the sectoral level. Thank you very much for having me. Please advance the slide. So let's begin by thinking about what we mean by energy security. Because in my view, there's a few different ways to think about this as a concept, and that has important implications for where we are in today's global energy system and how political leadership and public policymakers might think about energy security from different perspectives. So I break it up into sort of three baskets. You've got physical energy security, which I would roughly define as the availability of energy on demand. And when I flip on the light switch, the light comes on. When I go to the gasoline station, I'm able to fill my car with gasoline. This is a very familiar sense of us having security, and we have really advanced tools, which we can talk about in a second, for how to manage the physical security of the energy system. But we have seen, and I think a lot of analysts and observers intuit, if they don't study it rigorously, that the definition really is expanding beyond the pure physical security, the availability, to first what I would call economic issues of economic security. Is it energy available at acceptable prices? Right. So like there is a real connection between the prices that we pay for electricity or for gasoline or other energy sources for households, for the general economy, for manufacturers and other producers, sort of having a solid markets free of coercion with lower volatility seems to be sort of approaching a definition of economic security. I would also say that in the post-COVID world, economic security considerations also redound to the supply chain. After COVID spread around the world, factory closures in China caused U.S. manufacturers to no longer be able to access a variety of input goods. A key example is the semiconductors, not the really fancy advanced ones that we read about in the newspaper today, but basic ones that go into things like automobiles. That their inaccessibility raised prices, reduced the number of new automobiles that could be sold, which affected the used car market, all of which helped contribute to the large inflation felt by the U.S. During and after the COVID period. And that has like long-term economic repercussions that policymakers are still dealing with today. And so when we think about economic security in the context of the energy system, there's the immediate price, the pricing and immediate availability, but also policymakers want to understand, do we have a role in these value chains? Do we have a secure supply of these goods? And that raises, in the offshore wind context, questions about critical minerals, raises questions about the manufacturing of turbines or advanced magnets. And so when we think about energy security in this context, one of the things we see from a policy standpoint is policymakers being activated around making sure not just that the U.S. has affordable supplies of offshore wind, but also a role in the value chains that allow us to deploy offshore wind. There's a second benefit that comes from that related to jobs and employment, and we'll talk about that as well in a second. But there really is a security consideration there that we might be able to put some prices around, or at least kind of intuit, or rather point activity toward when it comes to things like public subsidy or other support. The last thing that we talk about is geopolitical security. How resilient is the energy system to shifting global security and political conditions? Here, I'd like to take the example of oil, which is the first row on the slide here, because many of us are familiar and have really, really long-term, sophisticated intuitions about the geopolitical considerations that go along with the oil system, right? The rise of the OPEC producers, their imposition of production controls to control volatility or to control price. Even this week, the president is negotiating later on with Vladimir Putin, and post the invasion of Ukraine, we've implemented a lot of mechanisms to try and starve Russia of oil revenue, demonstrating again the geopolitical considerations that fit into oil. One of the things we're still, the reason why I dive in there is like one of the areas where we are still figuring out um, what the new energy system is going to look like and how we think about energy security in a sort of transitioning world, or in a world where the energy system is diversifying rapidly, is how geopolitics plays, how economic security, and how physical security are going to play in this new world. I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like overall, and then we can discuss for the remainder of the presentation what that looks like in the case of offshore wind. Let's take physical security as an example. Around the world, 86% of people live in a net importing country in today's fossil system, right? So depending on how you count, 80 to 87% of primary energy still comes from fossil fuels. A lot of that is oil and natural gas. Coal as well crosses borders, but oil and natural gas are highly traded. And we've developed a lot of mechanisms to manage energy security in that world. In particular, the strategic petroleum reserves, where countries and firms are holding on to stocks of fuels and crude oil. So if there is a physical disruption, if there's a war, we have emergency supplies available to guarantee physical security. We also, I would argue, have developed pretty sophisticated mechanisms for economic security in that world, especially from a United States standpoint. We have a global marketplace for oil. It's a traded commodity. Trading houses around the world are able to move oil from where it is plentiful to where it is needed with a lot of efficiency. It's actually really remarkable over the last couple of years, despite all of the pressures we've seen on global oil markets that I think 20 years ago would have caused incredible pricing anxiety. That system has provided a lot of price stability against perceived risks because we have this global, relatively fluid, pardon the pun, market. LNG is moving that way. We saw over the last few years a real economic security story in the transition that Europe made coming off Russian gas, both the extra deployment or a accelerated deployment of renewables, including offshore wind, and a shifts in the LNG market provided for both physical and economic security for Europe. We'll talk about that case study hopefully in a few minutes. And then the geopolitical situation, many of us are familiar with. People have won Pulitzers writing books about the geopolitics of oil. When we shift to a renewables driven, basketing offshore wind into that category, we have to rethink what the security picture is for a system that does not rely on fuels. It relies on manufactured goods and infrastructure. Because the reality is all countries have some native renewable resource, whether that's sun, wind, hydropower. In the case of the United States, we are extremely blessed in this regard, and the offshore wind resource is too large for us to waste, in my editorial opinion. But power system performance does become an issue. Over the last 15 years, the U.S. power system, depending on how you measure resilience, has gone, or reliability has gone down in reliability. We now are, looking at immense load growth, which can cause problems for mismatch between supply and demand, and we need to figure out how to manage a modern and yet growing power system. That's the area of physical security where we now need to be more concerned in this sort of like shift to a renewables world, or in a world where almost all of the addition we're doing is renewables in nature. And here there's and in that world, there's also very interesting considerations around economic security, because we have witnessed over the last decades, the last couple of years notwithstanding, really significant decreases in the prices of wind, solar, even offshore wind has come down a lot in prices last couple of years accepted. Um, and so that you would imagine that a higher um, renewables world would kind of improve economic security if it's able to reduce prices, lower volatility. Um, but that we think that is often true, but it comes with some additional considerations. Most importantly, the supply chain is no longer fuels. You no longer have a flow problem. You have a stock problem. Does my firm have access to the value chains, to the supply chains that are going to allow us to not just operate or maintain our energy system, but benefit from its development and its growth? And in this case, the supply chain in the renewables world is, I mean, honestly, shockingly concentrated in China. That's sort of the that's most true in solar. It's increasingly true in wind. But one of the things that's very interesting about wind, and in particular offshore wind, is we see those supply chains as being relatively short. The machinery is too big to want to ship around the world like you would a barrel of oil or another commodity. And so those shorter supply chains actually could create some source of economic security, just because the nature of the technology is such that you want to be able to build and deploy it with a largely domestic supply chain, at least toward the nth level of production. On geopolitical security, this is still a very emerging set of concepts. Doesn't really have big implications for the U.S. offshore industry, at least at this time. But as we look at other energy sources, or the energy system and the electricity system in general, the cross border trade of electricity is quite complicated. I don't need to tell people in the Northeast about that fact, right? The trade conflicts that occurred earlier this year between the U.S. and Canada raised the idea that Canada might tax or hold back exports of electricity into New England. That would be a real issue for the energy security of that region. And we see, we'll look at least one case study in the course of this talk, well, addressing that kind of question as it has applied to offshore wind in other cases. But you encounter just a variety of other considerations. Globally, we need to think about energy finance, moving from a system that is fuel heavy to a system that is infrastructure heavy. OpEx to CapEx means capitalizing that system becomes an interesting problem. Again, not a big issue for the domestic offshore wind industry here in the United States, but foreign firms are playing a big role in the development of the projects we have today. And so there might be more geopolitics there than even I would flag today. And then lastly, trade policy becomes very important, because you're dealing with an energy system that is held up by manufactured goods. Are the tariffs, our willingness to buy goods from different countries. China is a particular example for us in the United States. Becomes becomes an issue for thinking about the sort of geopolitical security. Does the trading relationships we have today, are they going to look anything like the trading relationships we'll have 5 years from now? Given everything I've seen over the last 6 months, I think the answer to that is no. And so project planners, energy system planners need to be thinking about this sort of issue of geopolitics as we think about a very healthy and resilient supply chain. We don't want it to be so fragmented that it is fragile, but we want it to be diverse enough that it is resilient to changing conditions. And finding that right balance for any given technology is kind of tough. Again, offshore wind, because of the short supply chains, might be less challenged by that factor than others like wind and batteries. We can advance. Thank you. Okay, I made the comment earlier. I don't think I need to tell anybody here, but it's worth making the observation that the offshore resource potential in the United States is just absolutely enormous. This comes from the image comes from the National Renewable Energy Lab's offshore wind resource assessment done a couple years ago. The coloring shows us where there is potential for fixed offshore wind facilities, meaning the tower upon which the turbine sits is affixed to the bottom. Blue shows us where there is potential for floating offshore wind facilities. Fixed facilities, enormous potential on the eastern seaboard. That's a matter of geology. But there is significant floating potential on the eastern seaboard as well. For our friends on the West Coast, my homeland, that's largely, if we see the development of the industry there, it'll largely be on the floating side. But the nature of the resource is just incredible. It's large, as folks on the call must know, that the ability, one of the critiques of renewable power is that it is unreliable, in the sense that it doesn't, it only works when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. The proportion over which your facility can generate its expected power capacity or its maximum capacity is called the capacity factor, right? It's just like, of all the energy you could generate, how often can you actually do that? Averaged over a year, you get a percentage. Offshore wind, of the renewable resources, is I think the highest, if not one of the highest, in terms of capacity factor. Sailors have known this for a long time, but you get a little bit offshore and you just have a huge, stable resource. And so when we think about a world or a system that needs to, in response to climate change, the electricity system needs to grow a lot as we electrify cars and homes and a variety of industrial processes. As we have economic growth and we want to realize the benefits of that by powering more stuff, AI data centers or what have you, this like relatively stable, highly predictable, high capacity factor renewable resource, which has zero or near zero impact on the physical land where people live, is incredibly appealing. We can jump to the next slide. And I mean, the U.S. uses nowhere near terawatts of energy, right? So if you could harvest even a small fraction of it, you'd make a significant addition to our national energy portfolio. We at CSIS, we sort of track where states are in their ambition to build out offshore wind, how it fits into their energy planning. And there's just it's interesting. We have I feel both positive and that I feel both positive about what we have in terms of ambition, because we're going from near zero to up to 50 gigawatts, hopefully by 2035. Economic conditions and real deployment, I think, look like that's going to be significantly less, at least for right now. But the idea that you would add 50 gigawatts of a clean, relatively high capacity renewable resource is great for, I think, each of the components of energy security that I described before. Roughly under construction now, my estimate, reading newspaper announcements and kind of keeping track of where things are, is roughly about 5 gigawatts under construction. Coastal Virginia, New York, and Massachusetts are all continuing to develop projects despite some macroeconomic and economic headwinds. But I think it's worth also noting kind of how offshore wind fits into our national energy moment. So we've got, over the last year, we witnessed the arrival of AI and data centers as this like very immediate, very large demand signal for growth. Our work at CSIS, which we've done some independent estimates, shows that data centers for generative AI alone, this is like using ChatGPT or Anthropic products or the APIs of those things being embedded into products, is going to grow somewhere across the scenarios that we evaluated between 40 and 80 gigawatts between now and 2030. And if you extrapolate that to 2035, you get in excess of 100 gigawatts. This is on top of any load growth or electricity load growth you would expect from electrification of homes and vehicles and other elements of the economy. And this is such an unfamiliar terrain for our energy system planners and executives I mean, this is load growth percentages and figures we haven't seen for decades. We're trying to figure out how it's going to happen. And you can look at, well, there might be some efficiency programs. There's some stuff we can do to moderate demand. But if you kind of look to the generation side, it looks like we're going to need to add, especially when you incorporate coal retirements nationally, hundreds of gigawatts of new generation capacity, right? That's going to be solar, it's going to be wind, there'll be some natural gas, maybe we'll get some nuclear. But if we're able to realize stated state ambition, then offshore wind, particularly in the Northeast and along the Eastern Seaboard, where fixed projects can work, um, would be like an enormous contributor to what is not just a sort of like an energy problem. The stakes of getting the power system in the right place to accommodate both like new sources of economic growth and our desire to act on climate change are truly immense, right? This is top strategic priority, top environmental and diplomatic priorities, and so we like I as I said, I feel both optimistic in that going from near zero, states are, I think, legitimately trying to make gigawatts of offshore wind work. And it's not an easy thing to do for a lot of reasons that people here understand. Permitting it, getting public license, getting buy-in, developing a supply chain, making sure that it's affordable and helps reduce prices and contributes to economic security as opposed to punishing ratepayers. Like, oh, that's really important, but you just and doing and so realizing our ambition may be a challenge, but compared to what we need to do to achieve our national goals, you hope that we could even do more. So near term, optimism against, but qualified against the challenges today, and then a real desire to, if we can get over those challenges today, double down on the optimism we have, because I think that this mismatch is an energy security story for all the reasons we talked about before. Advance. This is a little bit of I just self promotion shamelessly. Um, you know, when I say that this becomes a top national priority, one of the insights that we've been arguing here at CSIS, this relates to the economic security question, is that we see across a variety of scenarios for the total electricity system an increasing electricity intensity of US GDP for the first time in about 50 years. After the 1970s, 1980s, as you can see on this chart, the terawatt hours per $1 trillion of GDP output that the U.S. economy had plateaued and then began to fall. And this maybe shouldn't be surprising. The electricity system was growing slowly. The economy continued to grow. There's probably a lot of efficiencies that we found over that time period. I imagine, clearly the buildings and infrastructure we build now is way more energy efficient than what we were building in the 70s, 80s, 90s, let alone the 60s and 50s. But because of all the factors I've already implicitly talked about, AI, electrification, the need to decarbonize, which is an electricity heavy process, we see that against trend, we're at an inflection point where to achieve the goals we have, we're going to need to increase the electricity intensity of US GDP. And that means that like the pricing of electricity becomes really, really important, or more important to U.S. Macroeconomic conditions. It means that getting the electricity system sort of resilient to the geopolitical considerations, to supply chain disruption, and more physically reliable are all very important, because if the system degrades at the same time, we expect the importance of electricity to national production to get to increase. We have like that'll cause all sorts of problems, political ones, economic ones, and we can't. That is kind of why I get excited about not messing this up. Advance, please. Okay, a bit on offshore wind, where I think there's an interesting energy security issue at hand. we have the nature of the supply chains are such that they're shorter, right? You're building a big offshore wind. It's a huge machine. You don't want to ship it. It's not like buying a bunch of solar panels that come flat packed from wherever and can be deployed, right? It's a different kind of infrastructure. That means it can be a lot more expensive, but it also means there's a ton of supply chain stuff that you can build along the way. NREL has done this really fantastic supply chain roadmap for offshore wind, taking the stated ambition and the national goals that we had under the previous administration and saying, like, what do we need to do to make that actually happen? 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030. Check it out. It's an incredible report. But it shows you need, a couple thousand of these turbines. You need 7,000 miles of cable. You need the vessels that are going to be able to build and service these fields. I argue that developing that system is an energy security investment, at least in part, because if we have a shorter supply chain and for this technology, one that allows us to expand it where we need to, if in 5 years we decide for any reason, well, it turns out we want a lot more offshore wind in the United States, right? Joseph's vision of this being a huge part of responding to our load growth challenges and the economic imperative means that we can build on the supply chain we already have, or use it at a higher capacity, as opposed to kind of scouring global markets. Global markets are great; they're efficient, but in designing for efficiency, you do like potentially lose some of the flexibility that can come from a shorter supply chain. Politicians, a lot of other people like this because it also means local jobs. And so as we saw states set up their ambition for offshore wind and realize how these supply chains were going to be short, you saw a lot of state efforts to see that harbor facilities and manufacturing facilities for nacelles and blades and would all sort of be located in regional consortia or within individual states. So there is an economic development or a jobs aspect to this. I just wanted to focus this talk on the given the prompt, on the economics on the economic security side of this. Valuing that economic security is challenging, but I think intuitively we know we're pushing in that direction. And then lastly, what happens if you're able to build that supply chain? Well, you get this security. You get hopefully lower volatility in the price of goods that you need to build the next marginal offshore wind farm. You get technical capacity from doing all this, right? These are highly trained jobs. This is, the ability to manufacture the goods that go into the turbines, the ability to work in an offshore environment, to install them. That's all like real capacity that exists in the workforce. And to some extent, you can export some of that, right? It might not, you might have firms develop which figure out really good ways of doing some of these processes, and they'd be able to export those to other places in the world that are also using offshore wind to meet their electricity needs. And when we think about, in particular, when we make about public investments in these goods, it's nice to be able to realize not just the benefits of the domestic market, though that is potentially huge, but also the whole global market. Okay, onward. Oh, this is my favorite example, right? So in the United States, we have cabotage laws, meaning that we place restrictions on commercial maritime activity. We need to build certain vessels that will do certain activities here in the U.S. There's a lot of debate about how much that actually provides for national or economic security, but over the last couple of years, Dominion, the Virginia utility, has been supporting the development of what we call the Jones Act compliant installation vessel, the Charybdis. That is undergoing sea trials right now. This is like a great pictorial example of what I was just talking about in terms of developing a supply chain, right? There's a ton of technical capacity that goes into building a vessel like this, let alone operating it. And we hope to see that thing out operating, building out the coastal Virginia offshore wind facility. I think later this year, if sea trials are completed. But that's, that when we're actually talking about like physical stuff here, and everybody likes pictures of boats. Advance. I did want to touch on Europe. We wrote a report earlier this year. The U.S. in the U.S. offshore wind is a pretty nascent industry. Our friends and allies in Europe have used offshore wind to great effect. And if we look at the experience of Europe over 2021 to 2023, we can see some of the concepts I've been talking about in their experience. So this chart's a little tricky. I'll walk you through it very briefly, but you've got terawatt hours on the vertical axis. And so you see demand in 2021. This was pre-invasion of Ukraine. And then you see for different reasons, reduction in nuclear and hydropower between 21 and 2022. That was reactors in France going offline, and I think droughts in the Alps. And so there's this like incredible loss of electricity, which has to be made up somehow. At the same time, Europe was transitioning away from Russian gas and exercising more renewables and buying more LNG. And so over that course of 2021 to 2022, they used incrementally more coal, very slightly more gas, though again that the source was changing so much that which this Power Plays report we published goes into more deeply. But like one of the things that because America ended up being a huge source of LNG into Europe, we sort of see in the popular imagination, or at least in the informed imagination, how much gas playing this heroic role. It did, but what the point of the chart is that it actually between 21 and 22, it was the extra use of wind and solar that contributed much more than fossil resources. And so this runs against the intuition of a lot of people. Like a lot of people see an energy crisis and they think we need to go back to the good old reliable baseload energy sources. Certainly, they do play a role. Don't mistake me. But given where the European energy system is and the deployability of this stuff once you build the infrastructure, solar and wind and offshore wind in large part played an enormous role in helping meet and respond to that energy crisis. So they, in this case in particular, the balance of this chart is a statement about physical security. Of course, the prices that Europeans paid over that time period were very, very high. Their consumers and households and businesses need a lot of state support to manage energy pricing over that time period. Europe now hopefully is on a better track to sort of manage those price increases over the long term and help reduce them. Again, largely by deploying more wind and in particular more solar. And you can kind of you see that many see that as a climate story in Europe, but the reality is in Europe, different from the United States in some ways, like the alignment between energy security and climate action or their climate goals, or rather, energy security and their climate goals are relatively aligned. And the role that wind and solar played, offshore wind a part of that, was really important to managing that transition. So I didn't want to talk about the role that offshore wind plays in energy security without highlighting that we've already seen demonstrable evidence that it does just that. Onward. The last thing I want to talk about, very interesting, and just maybe there'll be a good question about it. This is showing you the proposed North Connect project, which was a large interconnection line that would have connected wind farms in Scotland with the power grid in Norway and traded power back and forth to build a more resilient system across the two countries. the idea was that it would kind of operate like a battery, right? When you had excess offshore wind in Scotland, where there is, again, enormous potential in the North Sea, you would be able to reduce the use of hydropower in Norway, and then you would be able to use hydropower in Norway at other times. Sort of a virtual battery is how some people describe this. This was a gigawatt or a to 1.5 gigawatt scale project. Um, you know, it was never built. It was proposed for 10 years. The economics probably would have worked, but Norway, kind of citing security concerns, decided that it would that it didn't want to approve the project. And I found this quote from Terje Asland, who's the energy minister in Norway. It is important for the government to ensure that we have a power system that can at all times fulfill the basic needs of power supply. We need this hydropower and do not want to open it up to more exports. And we can talk a little bit about the context as I approach my time in Q&A if it's interesting. But the reason why I wanted to raise this, it's not so much an issue for the United States, but a lot of the intuitions you look at in that shift from the fossil world to the electron world, you think, well, a lot of our old problems are going to go away. And I don't think that's true. I think our problems change. You move from physical security being defined by the ability to gas up your car when you get to the pump to can the electricity system perform as reliably as we need it to at all times. You move from needing to manage the volatility in global oil markets to needing to figure out how you're going to build a supply chain which is meets your cost needs but also provides for security, and then hopefully some role for the US in global markets. And then you move from a world where geopolitics is really strongly influenced by concentrates power in a few producing countries to one where countries really need to weigh efficiency versus security, native resources versus lower prices, and I think that our issues when we look at adding new technologies in general, if you use them right, they help benefit you. But the fundamental challenges we all face thinking about the right composition of the energy system do not go away. So as much as I think there's a strong case for offshore wind as a tool of energy security and probably one that needs to be explored more, um, the world that we want to build is not free of geopolitics or concerns around a secure and resilient energy system. Thank you kindly for your attention. I've gone only 2 minutes over, so we have plenty of times for Q&A, and I greatly appreciate the invitation to speak today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. It's a really important and interesting topic. So I certainly appreciated your presentation. Thank you. All right, we have a few questions in the hopper and more are coming in. We have a question about tariffs. So lately there's a lot of rising tariffs. How do you see tariffs impacting the U.S. Economic energy security? And do renewables and offshore wind allow us to circumvent such tariffs?
I don't think they allow us to circumnavigate such tariffs. It a little bit depends on what you're tariffing, and the tariffs generally apply to the value of goods. And so the more you're inputting of a variety of goods and then building the whole machine here in the United States, you might be able to avert some. But the reality is, while we have these kind of shorter supply chains, there's still a lot of manufacturing goods or a lot of primary goods that do have to be imported. Um, that really is, it's a question of economic security, and that this is increasing the prices that basically any energy infrastructure is having to pay. I know that it is meaningfully impacting offshore wind projects, but it also redoubts the geopolitical security because in a world that has where infrastructure or technology are define the flows of energy around the globe, how countries treat trade becomes increasingly, really, really increasingly more important, and sort of in a subtle way, because tariffing energy trade in the fuel-based world kind of creates immediate price impacts for consumers.
Hmm.
Tariffing infrastructure, those price impacts are mediated by by a bunch of things. It's not necessarily that they don't create economic drag, but they're not necessarily felt or seen by consumers in the same way. So when we looked at tariff evolution over the last year, energy products, things like oil and gas, are usually exempted or tariffed at a lower rate than a lot of the other import goods that we see. And I think that that is both because there, the administration, which is driving this tariff policy in the United States, wants to see those primary goods or manufactured goods um, marginally made in the United States, where you can avert the tariffs. And it's possible that we'll build a lot of offshore wind stuff here in the United States, not just final assembly, but componentry as well. Um, and they're always striking a balance between that impulse and consumer pressure. Easier to do in the manufactured goods where price impacts are mediated than in the fossil world. But like when we think about designing an energy system, I think it's now apparent we need to think about the flows of these manufactured goods and how resilient today's trading system may be to a variety of political pressures, not just the US administration that we have today, but countries around the world, right? For example, we now have export controls on rare earth elements, which are hyper important for the motors that go into offshore wind turbines. And those export controls are replaced by China.
Yeah. A few other questions about diversifying the energy system, so I'll hit those before
Mm-hmm.
moving on. Um, who is or who are among some of the most important trade partners for the U.S. when we're considering domestic energy policy and energy security?
If you're thinking about the whole energy system as it exists today, do not discount Canada, right? People think like, wow, we get all of our oil and natural gas from the Middle East, but actually Canada is the largest source. And so when there was a U.S. Canada trade fight earlier this year, the fate of imports from Canada is really, really important. China looms large on any manufactured good. That's not just true of energy, that's true of a lot of manufactured goods. And then the deeper you go into the supply chain, where like take the rare earth element, take the critical minerals as an example. A lot of those things are a lot of the goods made of cobalt and nickel and magnetic metals and other things are assembled in China. Those metals may be refined in China, but they come from ore from around the world. So when like critical trading partners really are both our nearest neighbors, but can be countries like in very far flung places. Um, when we think about this industry in particular, we don't account for this kind of trade all the time, but it really investment flows do matter. The European companies, because they have a lot of experience building these facilities in the North Sea and in Europe, have played a very significant role in the U.S. industry getting a start, and I think will continue to do so. That sort of is less subject to some of the trade tensions we see on goods themselves, but needs to be recognized.
Awesome, thank you. Um, how do you see the current administration's halting of any new offshore wind leases impacting the offshore wind industry in general,
Mm.
and specifically new projects being able to get off the ground? And do you foresee that position changing anytime soon?
That's a spectacular question. I'm not sure that the halting of new leases is going to have immediate economic effects because it's no secret the industry is struggling to meet its build the projects that are already leased out. Higher interest rates, increasing input costs that come from tariffs, but also just are like still the post COVID supply chain. They really are affecting the investment picture before you got to tariffs and then the halting of leases. That said, halting leases affects the pipeline for decades to come.
Hmm.
And I think that if you look at the gap between what we expect power demand in the United States to be, and you look at the the potential that we could get from offshore wind, it is troubling that we're taking that option off the table. To me, um, I think that, do I expect to see that changing? We may. I think the president and a lot of administration leadership have very strong opinions about this industry. I know that there are equally a lot of local concerns that arise when big projects are being built. So it's not just the administration. Um, but I would hope that states are able to demonstrate the need and the economic viability of these projects, and that those two factors end up winning the day.
Great, thank you. Um, why would Norway have security problems with Scotland that would affect the wind turbine project?
Right? Yeah, it's so perplexing. You're like, oh, well, and they have a bunch of other interconnectors, right? So like I wasn't showing you a completely honest map. I do think so. It's a little bit of an accident of timing. In 2023, when they canceled the project, Norway had already been experiencing really high electricity prices because one of the ways that continental Europe managed the transition off Russian gas was by importing more electricity from Norway. That exposed Norwegians to higher electricity prices than they otherwise would have had. That's an economic security. It's a domestic economic security issue, right? So there you had, it's like very interesting. You had a sort of positive geopolitical security event,
Mm,
but it came with a cost for economic security in Europe, but also in Norway. And I think that when the sort of the degree to which a lot of interconnection provides stability and lower prices,
hmm
I generally believe, right? We wouldn't build these projects if it didn't. It raises, particularly at critical moments, security concerns, and I think that probably motivated uh, the um, the decision regarding North Connect. I don't think that in any way was a statement of distrust between the Norwegians and the Scots. I think it was much more sort of a uh, response to the pressures of the moment. It would be very interesting in your experts series to bring in a power sector expert from that region of the world, because they can describe the dynamics way better than I can. Hopefully I'm accurate enough, but I think that there's a pretty rich story there, and the lessons do translate, if not directly, to the same sort of dynamics that we feel on electricity planning between states, for example.
very good. All right, I'm going to try to squeeze in two more questions. Can you comment on the recent DOE report on the impacts of climate change and how that may affect the growth of various energy sources?
Yes, I'm happy to. I started my career as a climate scientist, so I speak as a person who knows a little bit about the issue. And I've spent I've written publicly a lot about sort of how we conceive of the risks of climate change. The report was written by 5 or 6 scientists who, if you're in the field, they have relatively well known opinions about the nature of climate risk, how severe it is, how compelling it is of efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Um, the art, it's a long and detailed report, so I don't want to like make broad stroke statements about its accuracy. There's a lot of it that I generally agree with. I think it raises important questions for how the government and the public should think about climate risk. One of the and then in any issue or any endeavor as complicated as climate science, you would find like places to nitpick. Scientists are famously a disagreeable bunch, and so like I think we're going to see over the next month and during the public comment period a lot of interrogation of the narratives in the report. Um, but I think the important things to recognize is it I don't want to say concedes, it recognizes the role that greenhouse gases have to play in driving latter day climate change. It has an interesting discussion of sort of how we think about that in extreme events. in extreme weather events, in sort of the role that greenhouse gas emissions play in driving global changes. Most of that is really like a scientific debate. Doesn't I'm less convinced that it has important public policy ramifications. But the last part is actually very interesting, and that is that the U.S. We're about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions right now.
Hmm.
Historically, we're a lot more, but right now 10%. So when you think about efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, get to net zero, it is true that our emissions, the U.S. emissions, are a fairly small lever against future climate change compared to the rest of the globe. How you manage that's a scientifically accurate statement. How we manage that, or how we manage the climate problem with that reality, is a real challenge, right? We've used the UN process to try and get a sort of buy-in to agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That has strained to meet its goals. And so any response we have toward climate does have to grapple with that reality. When I look at the report in sum total, I think that for me is the most important thing for all of us to think about. Sort of how do we drive greenhouse gas emissions reductions to reduce risks, recognizing that the U.S. Is not a particularly powerful lever metric that way. We have to think in other ways. Supply chains, developments in new economies, movement of finance. Those are probably better, more constructive ways to think about it.
Great. All right, let's get one more. Um, you showed a graph showing the energy and the GDP energy intensity,
Yeah.
and yeah, and so can we expect, or what do you think about, can we achieve more efficiencies in the GDP
Mm.
energy intensity after this AI boom?
Yeah.
And do we expect to see that plateau and then decrease, which was seen since 1980? Do you think we can achieve that again in the future?
I'm like actively working on a paper about that question right now, trying to understand what are the conditions under which you might see those curves kind of reverse again. What would be the next inflection point? I think if you pull back a little bit and you try and it's like very clear that AI and data centers are going to cause new
Hmm.
electricity demand that we hadn't really planned for. If you actually do the math against what we thought we would need to do for general decarbonization, electrification of vehicles as an example, it's not a shocking, the AI data centers aren't like a shocking number. They're pretty manageable actually. The way I've been thinking about that problem is if you can't do the data centers, you were going to really struggle to do all the electrification you needed to meet climate goals. Um,
Hmm.
the question that we're faced with though is like, how much can we meet all that demand and have it be more economically important, um, without kind of like breaking the power system or harming ratepayers? Those are the big questions. Um, and then sort of as technology and productivity from particularly AI, but a variety of other innovations happens, would we expect to see another inflection point? Those are big questions. We're still getting our heads around them.
Great. Thank you so much. So I think that's all of our time for today. So thrilled to have you on the webinar, Joseph. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us for this Learning from the Experts webinar. A reminder that the webinar recording and presentation slides will be available on NYSERDA's website.
Yeah,
Yeah,
super
our
cool.
next,
I'm going to watch that
yes,
benthic habitat one.
yeah, watch them all. This is our 57th webinar in the series, which is really impressive. It's been going on for more than 4 years.
Nice.
Our next webinar in the series will be on Wednesday, September 24th. Maureen Calgren with the United States Coast Guard will provide an overview of navigational safety considerations for offshore wind development and the role of the U.S. Coast Guard. You can register for future webinars through our events page at wind.ny.gov. We also encourage you to check out the past webinars in the series on NYSERDA's YouTube channel. And if you'd like to request a topic or a speaker for this series, please email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov or fill out our Learning from the Experts survey posted on our events page. Thank you again, Joseph, and thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for having me. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.